All right, anything else before we get started here? Cool. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Last week we talked about responsive design, right? So necessity nowadays requires a responsive web design, and we want to use CSS to automatically shrink and resize the content on our site to make it look good on different devices. So those devices are desktops, tablets, and phones. We specifically looked at using relative units last week. So we have the viewport width, the viewport height. We also have percentage that we can use for relative design, and then we have our fixed units, right? So those would be pixels. We're going to look at the fluid widths, media queries, and relative units over absolute units. And then we want to talk about mobile first design. So we want to understand, the concept of designing for mobile before we go into desktop, right? Whatever we build for a phone, it's scalable to a desktop. So let's go ahead and take a look at this here. So responsive web design is about creating web pages that look great on all devices. Here we have an example of a site, right? And it's designed on a mobile phone. And because it's designed on a mobile phone, whenever we scale it to a tablet or we scale it to a desktop, it matches, right? Responsive design is about designing HTML and CSS to automatically resize, hide, shrink, or enlarge a website to make it look good on all devices. Let's take a look at an example here. So to the right here, we have a simple picture, and to the left, we have our CSS style menu. So I'm going to take a look at some of the HTML that we have here. We can go ahead and find that image. We see that we have an image here, and we have a width at 100%. We decrease this down to about 50%, and then run it. You see the image changes. If we scale this, you can see the image changes with the scale of the viewport. All right, so we can do a quick sprint review of what has been covered so far. Go in here. So week 1, we went over creating a Heroku account, creating a GitHub account, designing a static landing page. Why is JavaScript important? Why is the DOM important? Why is CSS important? Why is HTML important? NPM is our package manager that we're going to use. Express.js is a server-side language that we can write in JavaScript. We did our introductions. We talked about what HTML is, what CSS is, what JavaScript is, and how we can use the document object model to manipulate objects. The past week, we covered CSS and HTML structure. All these tasks are listed as done, so they're not going to show up in here. The goal for this sprint is to cover CSS, media queries, selectors, animations, transitions, transforms, shadows, variables, grid, favicons, and search engine optimization. We want to touch on what Flexbox is. All right. So as we go through, by the end of this, these will all be marked as done. All right. So we have what are referred to as CSS media queries. So CSS2 was introduced and it made it possible to define style rules for different media types. Using media queries, these are a technique for delivering a tailored style sheet to desktops, laptops, and mobile phones such as iPhone and Android phones. Let's go ahead and click on this. So what is a media query? A media query is a CSS technique introduced in CSS3. So we've gone from CSS2 to CSS3. So it uses the @media rule to include a block of CSS properties only if a certain condition is true. Let's go ahead and try an example here. All right, so to the left, we have our CSS sheet. We can see that we have the @media query rule, and then it says only screen and max width of 600 pixels. If we resize the browser window, when the width of this document is 600 pixels or less, the background color is light blue, otherwise it's light green. So I can slide this over to light blue. So again, when the width of this document is 600 pixels or less, the background is light blue. And it's greater than that, it's light green. So we can use this @media query to do that. All right, we talked about style sheets and how we can use them in our HTML. So we use a link tag to link our style sheet to the HTML sheet that to the HTML document that we're using. And then we have the @media attribute, right? This @media attribute is important because it allows us to specify a condition for applying CSS. So we're conditionally applying CSS. All right. So what are a couple options for CSS media queries? Right? We have max width. Right? The maximum width of the display area is the size of the window browser that we're looking at. And the min width is the minimum width of the display area. The AND keyword combines a media feature with a media type or other media features. Right, so let's take a look at this example here. We're reusing what we have for showing background changing from light green to light blue, or from yellow to light blue. So here's our media query. We're saying only on the screen and maximum width is 600 pixels. So if we meet this condition, the background color should change to light blue. Here we go. So we can resize the browser window, and when the width of the document is 600 pixels or less, the background color is light blue, otherwise it's yellow. All right, so what if we try the opposite here? Let's go ahead and change this to min width. And this would be when the document is 600 pixels or greater. We'll go ahead and run it. You see the difference here? So when the width of this document is 600 pixels or greater, the background color is light blue. The AND keyword combines the media feature with the media type and other media. Right? So let's go over a couple of rules of thumb. A widescreen is about 1201 pixels or greater. A standard screen is about 769 pixels. That's what we're looking at for, a phone or something like that. 1200 pixels. A tablet, we got about 501 pixels to 768 pixels. And I guess mobile phones are typically 500 pixels or less, and landscape is 500 pixels or less. All right. Yeah, a really important feature here, right? The result of a media query is true if that media type matches the type of device the document is being displayed on and the expressions in that media query. So, right, we have this screen here, and then we have the condition that we're using. So when a media query is true, the corresponding style sheet or style rules will be applied. All right. Now we're going to talk about relative units. So we looked at fixed length, right? We have pixels, and here are some examples of relative units: EM and REM. So what do these mean? EM is relative to the font size of the element. REM is relative to the font size of the root element. So that's what those stand for. You can go ahead and click on this. All right, in this example, we have a paragraph tag, and this paragraph tag has a font size of 16 pixels and a line height of 2, I guess we refer to these as element units, right? So if we change this, it should resize according to the document here. So let's go ahead and update this to 10 EM. So see how the line height changes from 2 AM to 10 EM? And then we have our span attribute. So our span attribute is right here. And what we're saying is we want the font size to be about 0.5 EM. Remember how we talked about the span really being like a strip of paper? Let's see what happens if we increase this to 5 EM. Okay, there we go. Let's bring it down to something more visible. 1. There we go. Okay. Now we want to look at using rem. So this is relative to the root element. All right. So the font size of the div element is 2 rem, which translates to 2 times the browser's font size. All right. So this font size in this div element is 2 rem. Let's go ahead and change that to 5 rem. Change that to 5 rem, and we'll change this to 5 times browser's font size. See the difference here? This changes it to 5 times the relative size of the browser font. All right. This is useful with media queries, right? Based on the condition that you're using in that media query, perhaps you want to set a specific font size based on the parent element or the root element of the document. Now I'll talk about percentages of viewport. So viewport width versus viewport height in a percentage, right? So we can take a look at this example. In this case, we have an H1, and the font size is 20 viewport width units, right? So we can resize the width of the browser window to see how the font size of the H1 changes. We can scale the size as we increase the window size, scale down the size. The result size is listed over here, right? So why don't we try and bring this down to 10. There we go. All right. So we discussed the viewport width. Now we'll discuss the viewport height. All right. Similar concepts, however, when we scale this, you can see that when we scale it lengthwise, nothing really changes. We can try and change it so that we can scale it vertically. So that's the difference between viewport width and viewport height, right? It's the way that the page is being scaled. One's vertically and one is horizontally. So again, the viewport width is 100 slices from left to right, and the viewport height is 100 slices from top to bottom. Okay. So can someone tell me what a CSS selector is fundamentally?
It's whatever we're styling, I guess, like the element or the class or the ID. It's just whatever we're styling.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good start. So we have what are referred to as ID selectors and element selectors. We've covered those so far. And the syntaxes, we have the selector, the bracket, the property, and then the value. Yeah. So these are the elements that we're trying to apply style to, and we either specify them by an ID, or we can use a class, or we could use an element. We covered those 3 ways doing this, right? So we have what are referred to as advanced selectors. And we have a direct child selector. So the syntax for direct child selector is element, and then we have a greater than sign, and then element. And this is used to select elements with a specific parent. Now you want to note that these elements are not directly a child of the specified parent. That are not selected. So here's an example, right? We have a div, and we have a paragraph. So let's go ahead and give this one a shot here. All right. Here we're specifying a background color of yellow. we have a div, and then we have a paragraph tag. So what this is doing is it's going into the div, and then it's finding the paragraph, and it's adding a background color of yellow. Why isn't this section of the HTML styled?
Because you didn't specify the span that's in between the div and the paragraph.
Okay. Yeah. So what we'll do is, let's take this, and we will put it in here again. And we'll go ahead and put a span, and then we'll run this. Okay. And then we can get rid of this. So if we want to look at this from a hierarchical perspective, we can take the div, and we can go ahead and put this up here. So we have our entire div, and then we have the style of yellow, right? So everything's yellow here. Now I can turn this to blue, and I can turn this to green, and I can turn this to purple. Do you see the specificity of using this direct child selector? Okay. Then we have the directly after selector. So this operation works like so. We have an element, and we use an and then we have an element. And this selector is used to select an element that is directly after another specific element. Okay. So we're going to select and style the first paragraph element that are placed immediately after the div elements. Let's go ahead and give this one a shot here. So we're going to the parent element, and then we're going to the paragraph element that comes directly after that. So again, the element and element selector, this is what's referred to as directly after, is used to select an element that is directly after another specific element. In this case, we're going with a div and then a paragraph. And this element's being selected directly after that. Next, we have the by attribute. And the attribute selector is used to select elements with a specified attribute, for example, text. So we can style HTML elements with specific attributes. This attribute selector is used to select elements with a specified attribute. In this example, the A tag selects all the elements with a target attribute. So if we go ahead and run this example here, we want to find the A tag that has a target attribute. So why isn't that first A tag getting styled? Yeah, it doesn't have the target attribute, right? Where would be some cases where this could be useful in what we've discussed so far about designing web pages?
I'm thinking that you can style some links different than others.
Mm-hmm. Is there any like sort of navigation items that you think would require a sort of importance?
But I don't understand the question. Like as far as nav, when
Yeah,
we're using
so
nav,
like when we have a navigation, we could apply a specific style to help buttons or to a home
oh,
button, right? We can use that to say like this is actually an important class because this is an example of applying just a color. We've seen that other things we can apply through CSS though, right? We could add a border to this, right? We could specify a border, solid. So, this gives a user some sort of indication that this is an important link or an important navigation item.
so do we have to use the word tag in order for that selector to work?
That's a good question. It has to be the attribute. So in this specific case, we're using the attribute target. Let's see what happens.
target.
Yeah. Let's see what happens if we change this to href. See the difference here?
You could also use it to do the submit buttons. If you have a button with the type submit, you could use it that way.
Yep. Very good point. All right. So we now have what are referred to as pseudo selectors. So a pseudo selector is just a different sort of syntax that we're looking at, right? We have what's referred to as the first child selector, and this selector is used to select the specified selector only if it is the first child of its parent. We have the concept of a parent-child relationship between these elements. So if we look at a first child selector here, let me give it a shot. All right. So we have the element name, and then we have our pseudo selector first child. And we're specifying that we want the background color to be yellow. In this case, we have our paragraph, and we have the first child in this paragraph. So this paragraph is the first child of its parent body. Then we have a div container, and then we have this paragraph as the first child of its parent. So if I copy this, and I paste this here, can someone tell me which one of these numbers is going to have a background of yellow?
I would say number 1.
Okay, why is that?
So it's looking at, it's saying reach into the paragraph, everything that's a paragraph, and grab the first child. So it will, I guess, scan through the divs and then see there's a paragraph in the div, and the first child of that div will be the first paragraph, so it'll highlight that.
Yep.
What happens if you were to say put a header like a H1 before the paragraph? Will it still select the paragraph?
That's a good question. Yeah, so we're looking for a paragraph tag, right? And if the paragraph tag is not that first child, it doesn't get styled. Then we have the concept of the last child. So the last child selector matches every element that is the last child of its parent. So the example that we're going to look at here, we are specifying a background color for the paragraph element that is the last child of its parent. In this case, we have 4 paragraph tags, right? Then we have this last paragraph tag, and we're applying a background color of red. And can anyone tell me what CSS value this is? It's not a color. This is yes.
255.00.
Okay. We're starting to really break this down here. Yes, this is hexadecimal, right? And the last child that we're styling here is this 4th paragraph. So let's see what happens if we copy this whole thing, and then we put in our 5th, and then our 6th, 7th, 8th, whatever, 8. I'm going to put that in. Okay, and then we run it. So this is always going to pick that last child. All right. Now we're going to look at the nth child selector. So the nth child selector matches every element that is the nth child regardless of type. So n can be any number, a keyword, or even a formula. So if you wanted to use a number sequence, this can actually be used to style based on a mathematical formula. So what if we wanted to style all of the second children, right? Anything that appears as the second child of an element, right? So we have the second paragraph here, and we're saying nth child of 2. We can take this, and we can put it inside of a div. Can run that. So every time that we put in another element here, another container, and we apply this to it, it's always going to pick that second child, right? We can try and run this with 2n. All right. And we can do 2n minus 1. All right. Well, this is for every even one. And then we can do 2n. Want to get this to do 2n minus 1. This is for every odd one. So here we have our evens, and here we have our odd ones. We can copy this. Here's an interesting pattern. Who likes Christmas? Cool, right? We can make a Christmas pattern just using CSS. Good stuff. All right. So
I got a quick question. So what if, like, would you ever have 2 bodies?
2 body tags?
Yes.
No, we would only have 1 body tag. So the fundamental structure for an HTML document is an opening HTML tag, a head, and then 1 body tag, right? Our divs are going to be the containers. That's where you're going with this, right? So our divs are really our containers. When we think about how we're structuring our content, the div is that paper, spans are our strips of paper. So that's how we're structuring these things. Good question, though. Good question. All right, so as we saw, n can be a number, a keyword, or formula. So even is a keyword that can be used to match child elements whose index is even. The index of the first child is 1. Odd can be used to match child elements whose index is odd. All right? to go back to this. Let's go ahead and put in even. No change. Odd. No change. There we go. Flipped it. All right. So pseudo selectors continued. We have the hover selector. The hover selector is used to select elements when you mouse over them. So here we're going to select and style a link when you mouse over it. Let's go ahead and try this. So here are a demo of the hover selector. Put my mouse over it. You can see that as we do this, the background color changes to yellow. All right. So here's our A tag, and then when we use an A tag and we hover over it, the background color is going to change to yellow. Okay. Then we have the focus selector. The focus selector is used to select the element that has focus. Go ahead and open this. Give this a shot. So here's a demo of the focus selector. When you click in here and you put in your name, you can see that it changes the focus to the text input, right? The visited selector is used to select visited links. This is relatively important as a user is clicking on links in our site and interacting with our page. We want to give them some sort of historical context to what has been visited, right? So this visited selector allows us to style something that has been visited. Let's go ahead and try it. Here we go. So here's our link, and because someone has gone to this link, the color is changed to pink. Right, so here's our A tag, and here's our pseudo selector visited. So the visited selector styles links to pages you've already visited. Then we have checked. The checked selector matches every checked input element only for radio buttons and check boxes and the option element. There we go. So we have an input, and it's checked. And we're going to add a height of 50 pixels and a width of 50 pixels. Right? So if it's checked, this checked attribute here, it's going to change the height to 50 pixels and the width to 50 pixels. All right. So the check selector matches every checked input element only for radio buttons and check boxes and the option element. The next pseudo selector that we want to discuss is in range and out of range. So in range, the in range selector selects all elements with a value that is within a specified range. Note that the in range selector only works for input elements with min or max attributes. Okay. So we go in here and we look at the in range. So the in-range selector selects all elements with a value that is within a specified range. So try typing a number out of range less than 5 or higher than 10. So bring this down to 3. Okay. See how that styling disappears? And we bring it up to 11. The styling disappears. If we bring it down to 7, then it's yellow. So that's the demo of the in-range selector. We can type a number within the range here, and as long as it's in that range, we can see the styling here. Let's go ahead and change this to 2. Right? And now we can bring this down to 3. Yep. Color's still yellow. Now we have out of range. The out of range selector selects all elements with a value that is outside of a specified range. Okay. So here we want to select and style if the value of the input element is out of range. Let's go ahead and try this. So here's a demo of the out of range selector. You want to try typing a number within a given range between 5 and 10 to see the styling disappear. Okay, so we'll go ahead and put a number in here. We'll go with 6. And you see how the styling now disappears. Right? If we change it to 11, there we go. Styling comes back. So note that the outer range selector only works for input elements with min or max attributes. Continuation, we also have invalid. So invalid, the invalid selector selects form elements with a value that does not validate according to the element settings. So select and style only if the value of the input element is out of range. Yeah, we want to click on this one. Here we go. Just to reiterate, what we're looking at here is an invalid selector, and this selects elements with a value that does not validate according to the element settings. So select and style only if the value of the input element is invalid. Let's go ahead and give this a shot here. We'll try this here. All right. So here's a demo of the invalid selector. So try typing an illegal email address to see if the styling disappears. All right, so we have an input type of email and then the value of support email. So we can change this to support@gmail.com. Let's go ahead and change this to support Gmail. This provides an indication of whether the input is valid or invalid in the text box here, because the specific input type that we're looking at here is email. Okay. So we now have the valid selector. The valid selector selects form elements with a value that validates according to the element's settings. Okay. you can come back to this one. It's the same concept. Right? We looked at the invalid selector, and this invalid selector, if that value is not correct with the email, then what we see is a red border. So for a valid selector, as long as the email is correct, then there will be a border around it. So there's just a way where we just change that selector from invalid to valid. So it only works with form elements with limitations that have min and max attributes again, right? So email fields with a legal email or number fields again. So continuing on pseudo selectors, we have the after and before. So what these selectors are used for is adding content after or before an element, right? We have another property, this is a CSS property called the content property. And this is used to specify a value before or after a specific element. So let's go ahead and open this up. We'll go ahead and try this. There we go to the before selector. Could just be a link in here. All right, let's go ahead and try this. So we have our paragraph, and then we have our selector, and we have our content property. So our paragraph is listed here, and we have my name is Donald, and then we're adding the value read this before the paragraph. So if we change this to after, we run it, we now get read this appearing after my name is Donald. All right, let's go ahead and get rid of that and run it. So we can use this to add content before or after specific elements. And we use that content property with the before and after pseudo elements to insert generated content. In the continuation of pseudo selectors, we also have background image and overlays. We discussed the position absolute. So an element with position absolute is position relative to the nearest position ancestor instead of position relative to the viewport like fixed. Okay, so Riley's asking, what does this mean? So when we have a position that is relative to the viewport, that's going to change with the scaling of the viewport. So if we horizontally scale or vertically scale our viewport, that's going to change the position of the element, right? We'll look at an example. So an element with a position relative is relative to its normal position. And then when we have an element with position, it's position relative to the nearest position ancestor. So here's an example where we can look at two divs, one's relative and one is absolute. And we will go ahead and run this. So we have an element with a position absolute and then an element with a position relative. So as we move this, we can see how one of these affects the other. We have our relative diff, we have our absolute diff. So let's go ahead and change them. So now we have our absolute. And now we have our relative. And bring it back. So this div element has a position that's absolute, and this div element has a position that is relative. We also have the concept of a z-index. So the z-index property specifies the stack order of an element. An element with a greater stack order is always in the front of an element with a lower stack order. And it's important to note that the z-index only works on position elements. So it has to work with position elements. And if two position elements overlap without a z-index specified, the element position last in the HTML code will be shown on top. Let's go ahead and run this. So because the image has a z-index of -1, it will be placed behind the heading. Change the z-index to 1, it's placed in front of it. We also have the disabled and enabled pseudo selectors. So the disabled selector matches every disabled element. This is mostly used on form elements, and the enabled selector matches every element enabled, mostly on form elements. So we can take a look at using this disabled selector. Just to come back to this, so this will match on every disabled element. So we have elements that have this property on it as disabled. Okay. So we want to set the background color for all disabled input elements of type text. Go ahead and try this. All right. So here you have an input type of text enabled and input type of text disabled. So if we go to the element for the input type text disabled, we can see it's going to have a background color of gray. And then otherwise, if it's just input type of text enabled, it's going to have a background color of yellow. This is important for using a form, right? This Disneyland is not clickable. You can't modify it, right? So fixed form values, we keep this as disabled. And then if you have a modifiable one, which is enabled, then you can click and edit. In the example, we saw we could combine the pseudo selectors in that case on that form. Right? We can have our disabled selector and we can have our enabled selector together on the same form. All right, made it to CSS Flexbox, and this is a good stopping place for now.